Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the Cleone P. Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, Utahns cheer as frontline workers receive the first round of COVID-19 vaccinations, as many hope this is the beginning of the end of the pandemic. Officials across the country meet to cast the Electoral College ballots as the Biden-Harris team prepares to take office. And our panelists discuss the major stories from a tumultuous year.
Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Damon Cann, associate professor at Utah State University and mayor of North Logan, Michelle Quist, columnist with the Salt Lake Tribune, and Doug Wilks, editor of the Deseret News. Thank you so much for being with us. We're going to have a big year in review tonight, but we want to jump right into the issue that is taking hold this entire year. We're still continuing to work through the impacts of COVID-19. Doug, let's talk about what's happening in Utah right now. We hit another major milestone last week. We had 30 deaths in one day. We're leveling off in terms of those numbers, but lots of changes even now continue to evolve in terms of the restrictions. Yesterday, the governor changed at least one of those under some pressure about like alcohol, for example, the curfew on bars. Talk about that one and a little about the new quarantine policies.
Well, you know, what's really happened is we've learned a few things, right? You're not having super spreader events from schools. You're not having super spreader events at churches. If you wear a mask, if you socially distance, and you're in those controlled environments, we seem to be able to navigate well. It's when we have friends over to a house or an extended family or things when we're just sort of gathering or running out and not paying attention to the rules, if you will, that's when COVID is really exploding. How many times can you say wear a mask and socially distance, right? You know, if you count up the number of times that our health officials and politicians have done that, some people still just refuse to listen. But with 30 deaths, that's a very big number, and it's continued to climb, and it's come from some of the Thanksgiving week, I think.
You know, even for the show, we make sure we wear a mask, we do our spacing until right before the starts. We need to keep doing that as a state because it's getting into one of the bright spots, Michelle, and that is the vaccine is here in the state of Utah. Talk about how that is going to go forward in the state.
Right. So it's first going to, medical professionals, and, phase one is teachers and frontline workers. And I've seen pictures of my friends, doctors at Primary Children's who have received it. And for me, I didn't receive it, but that really helps me feel comfortable about if my son gets sick, we can go up there and, we're not going to get it from there. They have so much exposure to patients and things that are going on. And it helps the public realize that, even though the frontline workers are getting it first, they're getting it first because they need to, right. and it will have a ripple effect on the population. Yeah,
Damon, this has been a point of interesting conversation in the state. We had the frontline workers, and now we've added a couple. So we have people in long-term care facilities in that first phase, and added just this last week teachers and staff in our schools. Talk about that change. What kind of impact you see that having?
Look, teachers are putting themselves out there on the line every day. They're in contact with lots and lots of students. And so there's a particularly high risk, I think, for them. Also, when a teacher gets it, has COVID, they're in contact with lots of students as well. One of the things we've seen statewide is athletics teams and athletics coaches that get the virus tend to spread it. And so because you're there physically in with each other, and being able to get those groups vaccinated, especially those teachers, but really all teachers, I think will be a huge thing for limiting the spread of COVID-19.
This is a big concession, right? This is something that wasn't on the list, but our teachers have been talking about this, Michelle, right, to our elected officials. And so this is a big statement, just saying, okay, frontline workers, we're going to value teachers where they are in that first round.
It's a recognition of their value and the the jeopardy that they've put their lives in as they've been in the classroom with students.
Yeah, that is right. Now, go ahead, Doug.
Well, I was just going to say, you talked about the quarantine rules. What we've learned is that if a student has a mask, another student has a mask, a teacher has a mask, they've changed the quarantine rules. It used to be that you would maybe shut down the classroom or the school. people be away, and that's been such a point of controversy in the state about whether to keep schools open or closed. Now, understanding the spread, understanding the science, and understanding what is actually happening, just this week they made changes to those rules, so maybe schools can stay open.
Yeah, this was the effort there. I mean, the governor said in his, let me speak to the governors, less than 1% of those students with the mask-on-mask contact are spreading it, which was why they changed that. One thing, Doug, which was interesting too, is there's talk about who gets to jump in line. And our elected officials are going to great lengths to say no one jumps in line. In fact, strict protocols put in place, making sure that this phase 1 group is the only group that gets it.
Well, I mean, we don't want to disagree with that at all, correct? You know, and newspapers have editorial positions on these things. Healthcare workers, people who are vulnerable, the teachers certainly. If a teacher gets vaccinated, think of the ripple effect of that. Students are in a class, parents are able to go to work or work from home. Single mothers are able to do that when they're pulling, you know, the kind of heavy responsibility they have. So you can see where there's a strong ripple effect that becomes something really to support.
Yeah.
Well, and I don't think people should worry. I think it's going to go faster than expected. It already has. You know, they were talking about vaccinations in January, and now we're in December. And, you know, there's, 5 doses per vial, and now it's 7 doses per vial. You know, so it's going to go faster than it is. I think, as soon as people start receiving it, the transmission is going to go down because fewer people will be positive. And I think people should just be patient and realize that it's coming and keep wearing your mask. It's not that hard.
Damon, what's interesting is we talk about all the positives of this potential vaccine. There are some in the community that are maybe hesitant to want to get this particular vaccine for one reason or another. And interesting legislation even being brought forward for this next legislative session. Representative Robert Spendlove is taking a look at whether or not the government itself can mandate a vaccine.
Gotcha. Yeah. So we do have a number of vaccines that we require. You can't go to school if you don't have certain vaccinations. Universities require things for their students as well as the K through 12. The question is, should the coronavirus vaccine be one of those? We don't require it, say, for a flu shot or things of that nature. And Representative Spendlove, I think, wants to try to be out in front of this and let this be a matter of choice. The key question that's on everyone's mind, I think, is how many people have to get vaccinated in order to end the pandemic? And if we have 10, 15% of people who don't get vaccinated, a lot of the evidence so far says that that would be okay. But if we have 50% or more of the population that chooses not to get vaccinated, that could be deeply problematic.
So, Doug, this is a good point, right? The government does have a compelling interest in some of these cases, and sometimes in our history have mandated these kinds of things. What are you hearing about that, particularly given this backdrop of Representative Spendlove?
I think Dr. Angela Dunn did mention yesterday, if you can get to 70%, maybe 80%, but I think she said 70%, if I recall, that will be all right. So I think the focus needs to be on helping people realize that this is safe. One of the things to realize with the 2 vaccination approvals, it's an emergency approval, and they continue to watch the effects of that. And from a media standpoint, we have a responsibility not to overreact to a negative reaction, because then that can make people not take the vaccine. So there's a lot of conversation within journalism. Be careful how you report this. The case in Alaska where someone had a reaction to it. Well, that's very normal. It's part of the emergency process, and they did exactly right giving care to that person. So there should be no hesitancy to follow the protocols for everyone to get a vaccine.
Well, that's interesting.
Well, and we need to remember that the kids are already in school, most of them, except, everybody except for Salt Lake District. The kids are already in school, and they're not super spreader places. And so I think this policy is very consistent with a Republican-led state.
Well, what do you think about this great point Doug was making, too, about the reporting, but how people are perceiving this? Maybe is this why we see so many of these elected officials saying, not only am I going to get the shot, but I'm going to do it on live TV? You just saw Vice President Mike Pence. Obama says he would do it. Talk about that.
I think so. It's an example. It takes the fear out of the unknown, and it shows that, people who are in powerful positions or who, are intelligent and educated, think that this is worth it and that the risk is very low.
Yeah, Doug, do you agree with this as a paper, as you follow that? Is that going to have sort of the desired impact?
Is them
doing very public about their shots and getting vaccination?
Yes, example, you have to be out there and prove that you're willing to do it. We look at the example of politicians who would wear masks versus not wear masks. We hear from them all the time. You should see my email box every day, taking issue with whether it's wearing a mask or is the election over. The actions of our leaders make a big impact on the behavior.
Yeah.
And in Utah, perhaps if church leaders receive them publicly, that might also help as well.
Yeah. Very good points on this. There's been a thread through all of this we've been talking about when it comes to our public schools. I want to talk about that for just a minute. Damon, let's start with you because some interesting developments with our legislature this past week. As many in the state know, and we talked about it on this show last week, every district in the state of Utah, except for one, has allowed an option for either in-person or online schooling for its students. This week, our legislature made a pretty positive statement from their perspective about where they think these schools should be, saying they will give all teachers in every district that has both options a $1,500 bonus, which means Salt Lake School District, there's a little bit of pressure on them.
It does put a little bit of pressure on Salt Lake School District. Mayor Mendenhall from Salt Lake City was out being critical of this decision, saying Salt Lake teachers are working really hard too and deserve recognition for their work. But I see the other side of the coin as well. I mean, teachers who are doing both are really doing double the effort because they have a full spate of in-person classes that they're teaching. And then at the end of the day, when they might normally be able to go home or prep the lessons for tomorrow, they're repeating the process again for online students. And it's a lot of extra work to do both.
Yeah, so Michelle, so there's the question of the work, but that's not really what they're trying to get to, right? At the end, the legislature is saying we're trying to get to the students,
right,
that they want to have this option. Talk about that.
Right. I mean, the incentive is for teachers or for school boards, school districts to offer a choice for students to be able to go into school. The Salt Lake City, there have been reports that students are failing. Online is really hard, especially for the younger grades where elementary schools don't see a lot of spread. And, the incentive, Governor Herbert at the very beginning, before school started, changed the standards so that Salt Lake City could open and could have students in, and they decided against it. I don't think this is a punitive measure against the teachers. I think it's a recognition that this should be an option, and that those that are doing both and that are, jeopardizing their health by being in a classroom deserve a little bonus.
Mm-hmm. Doug, the Speaker of the House, Brad Wilson, is the one that made this motion to try to compel the Salt Lake School District, but also to give this incentive, as Michelle was just talking about. Talk about the policy implications of that and why the legislature would be so strong on that and why we still haven't seen much movement from the Salt Lake City School District.
Well, those legislators made the point that they're giving tens of millions of dollars to education, making the point we're the only state to do that during a pandemic when so much money has been lost into public coffers, and trying to sort of mitigate the controversy about Salt Lake City's teachers not getting this unless there's a change. My issue with it is the reasons they put for giving the bonus is because of the hard, dedicated work that teachers are doing. And Salt Lake City teachers are doing that hard work, not lesser, every bit as dedicated. And if that's the reason you're giving the bonus, then give them the bonus. There's no question it provides leverage to try and open it up. So if you look at what's real, what's the science is we're not having super spreader events at schools. So should the school district take a look at doing something that a lot of parents really want to open? Wear the masks, use the protocols. And then do we treat teachers the same? This shouldn't be a either or, right? It should be, let's find the best thing to do.
That's right. But
especially with their concession that, that teachers get the
vaccine.
Thank you. The vaccine. We're protecting them on multiple levels.
Mm-hmm. We are. And Damon, just another point on this, because Speaker Wilson talked about all the things Doug and Michelle just mentioned, but also talked about Salt Lake School District, the online courses, but also where online occurs throughout the state has not been working very well. So doubling down on the part that's not working very well seems to be what the legislature is trying to get to as well.
Yeah, I can speak from personal experience as most parents out there can. It's been a real challenge to have students at home, even as each of my kids have been in quarantine, except for my youngest in elementary school, some of them a couple of times due to COVID exposures in school. And that period of time that they're out is much more difficult for them to keep up. They often go back to school being a little bit behind. And we need to have the online option because there are families out there for whom even the modest risk of being in a school is too much for them to take for a child with certain health conditions. So we need to continue to provide the online option. But we can find ways, I think, that the evidence is becoming clearer and clearer that we can find ways to get our kids to school, and with appropriate safety measures, we can have them there, and the vast majority of students can receive a higher quality education in that way, face-to-face.
There will already be very serious consequences with how far behind our students are with their reading levels, their science levels, their math levels, their inability to concentrate, the graduation rates, the scholarship availability, college readiness for tests, all of that. We are going to see that in the next 5 years that have a deep effect on our children, and it makes a difference.
Let's transition for just a moment. Doug, big week here when it comes to the presidential election. Our electors met. They voted. So really, here's the question for you. Is it over? Do we know who the next president is going to be? What's happening?
Yes, it's over. It's been over for quite a long time. The Electoral College vote made it official for everyone. Utahns voted for Donald Trump. Those votes were accurate. They were counted. They were credited to the electoral total. So yes, we do move on. We do move toward a transition. President-elect Biden's putting his cabinet together. People are analyzing what does that mean for the future. And everyone's extremely excited about the vaccination. That sets a benchmark for going forward into the new year. President Trump and his team can take credit for much of that. And now we move on.
How about as the state of Utah? Because we were kind of there already, right? Except some of our elected officials got involved to some extent.
Yeah, obviously Attorney General Reyes was involved in the lawsuit. Many Utahns upset about his involvement in that. Not specifically a Utah value, although some Utahns, agreed that they wanted him involved in that. He also went down to Nevada and just the idea of interrupting other states' elections and thinking that we have a standing, like the Supreme Court said, we don't have standing. This is, federalism matters. If it matters when we want to assert our rights, then it matters all the time. And each state has the right to decide who won their state. And it's been through the courts over 50 times. I guess this is, the weekly decision that Biden won. Like, we already know that. Like you said, it was over a long time ago, and I think we're ready to move on.
Okay, it seems like we are.
Yeah.
There's one more item from Washington, D.C., Damon, because before we talk about the other big stories of the year, Congress is currently still debating the next round of stimulus for the United States. It looks like a deal may be close. Maybe talk about any of those details right there and why it matters right now as we get ready to head into these holidays, into the new year.
Well, as Congress looks to go into recess, they'll be away from the levers and switches of lawmaking. And at the end of the year, the CARES Act funding that has provided support for paycheck protection, for rental assistance, and a wide variety of other things that have helped keep the economy and other aspects of society afloat, that all expires at the end of the year. And when that funding switches off, there's going to be some challenges and some gaps for people who are still struggling from the effects of the coronavirus. And so the question is whether or not Congress can get something done now before they go on break for the holidays, so that when January 1st hits, some of the things that need to be continued to provide support can keep going.
Doug, what are you hearing is likely to happen, and what's going to have the most impact?
Well, the most impact is money for the lower economic end, funding the SNAP program for food assistance, because as soon as you do that, that money is spent and goes into the economy. Rental assistance, unemployment insurance, those things really boost. Our economists in Utah talked months ago saying the worst is over, with the assumption that you get a second stimulus, and we haven't had it yet. So you keep waiting to get toward the cliff, and you don't want to have a stimulus when you're already over the cliff. Yeah. A lot of talk about the $600 payment for individuals. Everyone feels that. That's a good thing, but in terms of really stimulating the economy, that's lower on the list, like number 9 or 10 for having an impact.
Well, we have potential government shutdown this weekend as they continue to work through this, right, Michelle?
Yep.
But Monday, is that what we're thinking?
Yep. Yeah, hopefully. And Salt Lake City's offered assistance recently with the rental and the food for citizens who might have been in a gap and hadn't received other assistance. It's important.
Yeah. Okay, we'll watch this one closely on Monday. Do you mind if we jump into, I'm just curious what you all think has been so big this year, because I want to hear what you think the big stories are, because there have been so many. And this is the year that keeps giving, and not always in the most positive ways. Can we start with you, Doug? What would you say? As the editor of this great newspaper, the Deseret News, what would you say?
It's COVID-19. It's a pandemic. It's worldwide. It's affected everyone on the planet. Has there ever been anything bigger in our lifetimes, really? You layer in the economy with that. You layer in changes from sports to everything else, the shutdown, education. There is no bigger ripple than that. And we've had a lot of news from earthquake to windstorm to everything else. But clearly it's COVID, and there's a lot of slices for that.
Yeah, it's true. One of those things that I found to be so amazing, Michelle, is this Operation Warp Speed. When it comes to this, the degree to which the country came together, our scientists, the medical professionals, to get this vaccine.
No, it's amazing, and nobody thought it would be so quick. And those who claim, oh, America did it. Well, it's partnership with others, and I think we need to be grateful. We just came out of Thanksgiving, and be thankful that this is possible, that science can produce this kind of result in the time. But that's not my story of the year. Okay.
I want to ask one more question on that one. Damon, if I can ask you, just it's something I've been thinking about on this issue. For such a long time, up and through this election, it seemed like there was just so much politics behind the COVID-19 response. I'm curious, since the election, if you've seen any change there. Are we coming together now more than we were divided when it comes to the issues surrounding it?
I think there's been a little bit of softening, but one thing that I think the pandemic has really taught us is that our divisions that are so deep and profound in this country are an obstacle to making progress on fundamental issues that everybody should agree on. That polarization has halted and slowed our progress. And while we've been able to still achieve some positive things in terms of science moving forward on the vaccine and those kinds of things, we've really struggled, and it's been a more difficult slog through this pandemic, I think, because of political polarization, and I don't know that the election outcome is really going to resolve that.
Interesting points. Thanks for that, David. Your story, Michelle. Okay, I can't wait to hear.
I think it's the year of the woman. I think that it has been a year-long recognition of things that have been and things that we need women to be involved in policy. It was the First to Vote campaign and Republican women's involvement in the Arizona election and, the election of our lieutenant governor to come, Deidre Henderson, and the vice president to come, Kamala Harris, and cabinet, secretary appointments. I think we're finally understanding that women can be involved and that they should be involved, and that when we're involved, things work out better.
Absolutely right. Totally agree with that, too. How do we keep sustaining this?
I wish that we had this year of all that the First to Vote campaign had planned. There were so many activities that we couldn't do because of the pandemic. But I think the way we sustain it is by keep talking about it. And I know I'm a broken record on this subject, right? And people perhaps maybe dismiss me because I keep talking about it, but I'm just going to keep talking about it because somebody has to, and it makes a difference.
Okay, that's a great story.
Jason, can I give you one thing to look at? One of the big stories appearing as Spencer Cox becomes governor of Utah is the relationship between the governor's office and the legislature. Because with the legislature's ability to call special session, I think that has gotten in the way a little bit of the messaging coming out of the governor's office in terms of the pandemic response. And is there a power struggle there? We need to watch and look at what happens and how Governor-elect Cox is able to navigate that.
It's so interesting, particularly given that he was a former member of the legislature and Deidre Henderson, his lieutenant governor, also a former member of the legislature. Yep. Very good point. Can't wait to see how that goes.
And also watch the cyber attacks news that's come out this week.
Oh, yes.
Very, very strong. There's a lot to come there, and it's very scary. And we haven't talked about it because of everything else going on, right?
Yes.
So watch that.
Right to be concerned about that. I think the dominoes are still falling on that cyber attack. Great one, too. Damon, let's take a moment. Your story that you'd like to talk about.
Well, shoot, 2020 is so full of stories that on their own could have characterized an entire year. One that I'll just mention briefly in passing, we started 2020 with a president who was impeached and then was ultimately, when tried in the Senate, was not removed from office. But that would be news that in any other year would have filled the remaining 10 months of the year after it happened, but it kind of disappeared because COVID materialized just as the Senate decided not to remove the president from office. But we can't talk about 2020 without talking about racial issues. The Black Lives Matter protests over the summer, the death of George Floyd. We will not police after 2020 in the same ways that we policed before 2020. And I don't think that we can go back to the same set of attitudes and beliefs that some of us had held, some members of our society had held prior to 2020 on racial issues. And while sometimes that slipped behind or beneath the surface because of COVID, I think the conversation about racial justice and equality is one that's going to be moving forward in the years ahead.
Got about 20 seconds left on this. When you agree,
Oh,
where's this
I
one going?
completely agree. And I think we will be better. I think we will never police the same, and it's a good thing.
Yeah, this has risen to the level of our consciousness. We're all thinking about it, appropriately so. Got to keep thinking about it. Thank you so much for your great insights this evening and a preview of what's happened and maybe a little sign of what's to come. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
and thank you for watching the Hinckley Report. This show is also available as a podcast on pbsutah.org/Hinckley Report or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you for being with us, and we'll see you next year.